Good morning. I'm Ann Braude. I'm the director of the Women's Studies in Religion program and also a member of our faculty in American Religious History. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to HDS. It's always a buzzy moment to meet the incoming class and all the energy that you bring. So thank you for being here, and I'm really thrilled to have our introductory panel for the Women's Studies and Religion program as part of the Vital Conversations Day of reflection and discussion as part of orientation. Kind of brings us back to the roots of the WSRP, the way the program was founded, which really came from student initiatives in the 1970s who were putting things on the table, conversations that weren't happening, people who were excluded, a lot of people who were excluded from the curriculum and the faculty, and students really challenged the faculty to see how could we address that. And the Women's Studies and Religion program was founded with the goal of creating a new field of academic study. We're going to introduce our 5 research associates today. Every year, we bring 5 new people. We do an international search every year. We look at about 100 new projects in women's studies and religion, and we choose the 5 that we think will add the most to our conversations at the Divinity School and to the larger field of women's studies and religion, which we hope we've contributed to creating. If you all have a list of this year's research associates, if you look on the back of that, you'll see the over 170 or lost count a little bit, research, over 170 women scholars and 3 men who have participated in the program. And I hope you'll see the names of lots of people that you've read as undergraduates and that you'll be reading at your courses at HDS. That's really what our goal is to change the canon, to expand the canon. From its inception, there was an insistence that there had to be diversity among women if we're going to move our understanding forward in this area. I think what also connects it to today's conversation is that from the beginning there was an understanding that this isn't just about a gap in scholarship or a gap in knowledge, that it's an issue of justice, that expanding our curriculum to be more inclusive immediately draws us to moral issues about who is at the table, who is not at the table. And after about 30 years in this program, there's still places to push that, and I think we'll be doing this for a long time. It's a great pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's panel, the president of the HDS Student Association, Zahar Shahid. Zahar is a second-year MDiv student who is focusing on the study of women and gender in Islam. So she's a great moderator for today's panel. Zahar.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ann and Tim, for having me here, and hello to all of the panelists once again. I'm going to get started really quickly by introducing all of our panelists briefly, as you all have their information right in front of you for more detail. I'm going to start off on my right with Susanna Drake, who joins us from the Women's Studies and Religion program from Macalester College. She received her PhD from Duke University and an MTS from Harvard Divinity School, so welcome back. Her first book focused on slandering the Jew, sexuality, and difference in early Christian texts. Her second project focuses on veiling in early Christianity. Then we have Lynne Gerber, comes to HDS from the University of California, Berkeley, where she did her doctorate at the GTU after completing her master's at HDS. Welcome back as well. Her first book was entitled Seeking the Straight and Narrow, Weight Loss and Sexual Reorientation in Evangelical America. Was published by the University of Chicago Press. Her new project tells the story of the Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco, a gay lesbian congregation, and its religious engagement with AIDS. Welcome. Septemmy Lakawa teaches feminist theology at Jakarta Theological Seminary in Indonesia, where she serves as the director of the Graduate Studies program. At WSRP, she is revising for publication her award-winning Boston University doctoral dissertation, Risky Dialogue, Muslim and Christian Women Practicing Interreligious Hospitality in the Aftermath of Religious Communal Violence in Indonesia. And then we have Yuhang Lee. She hails from Beijing, where she studied art and art history before coming to the United States for a doctorate at the University of Chicago. She studies the construction of gender through material and literary production in Chinese religion, including hair, embroidery, and clothing. And last but not least, we have Grace Nono, who was a popular singer in the Philippines before completing a doctorate in ethnomusicology at NYU, but both her doctorate and her current book focus on the musical healing chants of indigenous women shamans. She has published 2 books and multiple articles about the traditions of healing chants. Her current project is entitled Babylon Sing Back, Philippine Shaman Voices on Gender, Religion, and Transnationalism. So if you could do me a huge favor and give a quick applause to our panel before we get started. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll start off asking specific questions for each of the scholars here today and get to know them better and hopefully get more information from them because, again, remember that you have the opportunity this year to take classes with each of them and learn more about what they've done their work on. We're going to start with Septemmy Lakawa. So you've lived through religious violence in Indonesia. Can you help us understand the sources of religious violence?
It is a complex discourse. If we want to know what is the source of religious violence in Indonesia, in my research, I look at both the intertwinement of both the political and the religious sources of religious violence. From within the 10-year period context, from 1995 to 2005, Indonesian people have witnessed the rise of communal violence that involve particularly Muslim and Christian communities. And in my research in the eastern part of Indonesia, I look at the ways in which both the political and the religious come together, and then the way the community, my particular research focused on Christian community at the time, and they really did not understand why they kill each other. But then the only symbols and narratives and texts that are very familiar to them definitely are religious symbols. So although many anthropologists and literature looking at the resource and sources of conflict is better political and economic, but if you come to the field and interview people, those who are religious communities, the only thing that they could answer through their perspectives and narratives and experiences, mainly religious. So in that case, whenever you say that the sources of the violence is political, then you have to add many other dimensions, and in which case, in my research, I look at the intertwinement between the politics and the religious.
Thank you. Just a little bit more on that. Where do women fit into religious violence and its solutions?
They fit in very, very much. I interviewed about 30 women in Halmahera, mainly those who are ministers. There are 10 of them who are ministers, and the rest are lay people, lay women. And in my interview, I found out that they experience violence differently with the way their male colleagues. And for example, one of my respondents says that they could not ignore that they also had become the perpetrators of violence. However, then they have to carry the burden of remembering that part. But they have within their heart the urge to work for peace because that's the only option that they have. And I continued the research after I finished my dissertation, and I worked with Muslim and Christian communities and asked different questions, whether or not there is a different way of reaching toward peace if it is done by women. And the answer to that is yes. And they say we cannot do dialogue as what male have, acquired to do dialogue as at the elite level, because for them dialogue is part of their everyday life. And they see themselves as sharing stories as part of the solution to violence and to be able to overcome violence. And how do they fit into the huge narrative of peace and reconciliation? I can say that through their stories, their own stories, and their daily life and activities, and also through, and this is part of my research and my focus, is through different ways of dealing through arts and what I call aesthetics, interreligious aesthetics of peace.
Thank you. We'll come back to you a little bit. We're going to move on to Susanna. Your book will be the first study of veiling in early Christianity. What are the ethical concerns you bring to this work?
Thanks. And I have to say, the first long book-length study of veiling in early Christianity, because I do stand on the shoulders of people who've written on this subject a little bit before. And the ethical concerns, some of the ethical concerns that I bring are some of the ways of reading texts that I learned here. And one of those is to always look for relations of power. How are those inscribed in texts or in objects? And to pay special attention when you have an asymmetrical relation of power. And how does that intersect with gender, right? How does feminism help us expose asymmetrical relations of power between men and women? How does that intersect with class or with ethnicity? And this it gets trickier as you go back in centuries. From the texts that I study are, for the most part, written by men. So I also have to consistently ask questions about the rhetoric of the text and how to think about the silences and gaps of the text as productive spaces to think about women, since we can't kind of retrieve women's voices as confidently as we might in more recent eras. So those are some of the the ways that ethics informs my historical scholarship. And then I think in both my scholarship and my teaching, I always try to be aware with my students about the presuppositions that we bring. And here the presuppositions and biases that we bring to the study of veiling in late antiquity, for example, is informed by the variety of messages that we're getting in the US culture about veiling and Muslim women's veiling in particular. And so there I think it's really important to think through those biases. I have just one example. A few months ago, I live now in Minnesota. A few months ago, I was telling someone in Minnesota, not an academic, but just someone who, a friend of mine that I was studying women's, she asked, what are you working on next year on your sabbatical? And I said, women's veiling. And she said, women's failing? And I said, no. Women's veiling in early Christianity. And she said, oh, same thing. And after I did what Anne just did, which was a deep inhale, I thought, this is a view that so many people in the U.S. have now if they're fed a kind of daily diet of Islamophobia. And it's informed by colonialism and all sorts of things. But how do we take that bias that's present, that equates, too often it equates veiling with oppression or women's subordination in some way, and unveiling as freedom. And I'm interested right now in how that bias in particular has informed previous studies of early Christianity or Greek and Roman women's veiling. So just one example of how to identify those biases, work to expose them, and understand how they're formed so that we can start to dismantle the dangerous ones.
Thank you. As a follow-up, how do you think your book currently informs or is able to broaden the discussion on the veiling of women in the U.S. today, as veiling is usually just synonymous with Islam?
Right, yes. So I think, first of all, for my course here and for the kind of theoretical background of this work, I have really enjoyed going into the field of the study of Islam more than I had in the past, to think about the really sharp theoretical work being done by many Muslim women and Muslim feminists writing about this issue. And so that has informed a kind of broader methodological concerns that I have, even thinking about how we can conceive of veiling as a practice of freedom and use that lens as we look back in time. And second of all, again, I'll pick on Minnesotans. When I love Minnesotans, but and they're not all the same. But when I was saying that I was going to be teaching a course on, or thinking about veiling in early Christianity, they said, "Oh, that's so funny, because now when I think of veiled people, I think of Muslim women." And that, and she said, but if you think of the Madonna, right? Madonna is always depicted as veiled. So an early Christian woman who, in all of our early art of her, in our medieval art, it always has a head covering. And so I think that I think it's also important to think about what are traditions of veiling that predate Islam, and currently, this is something I'm just starting to think about, what are the other veiling traditions in Christianity, in Judaism, that are with us today as well?
Perfect, thank you. Yuhang, you studied the way women depicted a bodhisattva who was a male in India but became a female in China. What can we learn from this transition?
First, thank Sahara's wonderful question, and also thank you for your wonderful introduction. This actually, I'm basically an art historian. This is actually my first time to speak with a large group of people in religious studies. So I'm really looking forward to your questions. As Sahara said, my project is basically about this feminized deity in Chinese called Guanyin, so originally a male deity in India. Of course, the Guanyin basically, so for people who are not familiar with this tradition, I just probably briefly introduce who he or she is. Bodhisattva Guanyin literally means the perceiver of songs in Chinese, but in Sanskrit, Avalokitesvara means the Bodhisattva of compassion. One of the main characteristics of this Bodhisattva or deity is he or she has the ability to transform into different roles, which encompass hierarchical and gender differences, which means he can transform from celestial world to the secular world, or from human being to non-human being, from male to female. Which is very unique power. But then the question is, this deity was represented as a male deity in India, and also in the beginning when Buddhism was introduced to China. And then gradually, starting from 6th century, we see the gradual changes of the gender of the deity. By the beginning of 14th century, so this deity was transformed into a female deity. Of course, Buddhism was widely practiced in Asia, and also this deity was also worshipped in various regions in Asia. But this gender transformation only took place in China. So then the question is why? There's tons of studies about this gender transformation. We can spend the whole semester to talk about this issue. But one main thing is, of course, is really closely related to the social structure and also Chinese indigenous ideologies like Confucianism, and also gender structures in China. So one thing is interesting. scholars have approached this issue basically from two perspectives. One is from this the meaning of compassion. So one thing is in Chinese culture tradition is the compassion represented by more like mother figures. But then this actually is more contradict to the Buddhist tradition, especially Mahayana Buddhism. So actually mother represent wisdom, father represent compassion. So we see this very interesting hybrid forms of this gender transformation. Gradually they change a bodhisattva of compassion into, and combined with Chinese indigenous idea of compassion as feminine come together. And then, of course, second approach is to discuss the gender of the worshipper and the gender transformation of a deity or worshipped. So a lot of scholars think this gender transformation of this deity, Guanyin, is intimately related to social structure and also gender relationship in Chinese society. Especially, we often talk about Confucianism, who actually promote the idea to separate man from woman, as outer space from interspace, or women are confined as certain forms and space. Like for instance, you have to follow your, before marriage, you follow your father. During the marriage, you have to be obedient to your husband, and then after some women became widow, so they have to follow their sons. And also Confucianism also promote the female virtues, so womanly virtues, womanly speech, womanly manners, and so on. So all those indigenous ideologies combined with this feminized Guanyin. Of course, if we look at the feminine forms of Guanyin, we actually see it's very interesting that somehow, of course, Buddhism, people often, when talking about gender in relation to Buddhism and Confucianism, so people think Buddhism actually provide alternative space for women to pursue their spirituality. But of course, there are also issues of gender inequality in Buddhist doctrinal text. For instance, in Pure Land Buddhism, women cannot reborn in the Pure Land in the form of female bodies. But in general, we see this, this feminine Guanyin manifestations actually provide different models for women, mirror different stages of their life cycles, from teenager girls to the old women. So it's very interesting to look at. Of course, my own work actually deals with the post-feminized Guanyin period. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm curious on that note. Is there a movement at all in China by either men or women or scholars of any kind to go back to the pre-6th century?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question. Of course, when we talk about, by the 14th century, this Guanyin already transformed into feminine forms. It doesn't mean that male forms disappeared after 14th century. So it's interesting, especially because I'm an art historian. If we look at visual materials, a lot of male artists try to insist on the male forms of Guanyin. So of course, from 14th century to 19th century, when we look at more kind of masculine Guanyin forms, somehow that on the one hand it's represent archaic forms. On the other hand, I think it's still those male scholars or painters still want to show that they can. But Guanyin also is a male. So it's a very interesting issues. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Grace, your project actively opposes colonialism by amplifying the voices of Indigenous women. Do you see music as a vehicle of resistance?
Thank you, Sahara. Hello. I'm dealing with asthma. Pardon my voice. I think what I'm trying to do is trying to see how colonial values loom large in contemporary Philippine life, at least in 3 areas. In gender, we say that before the coming of the Spaniards, before Catholicism, the women could become priests. We call them babaylan, and the babaylans have not been wiped out by colonization. I am trying to assert this in my study. We continue to have women priests, but they have lost their social status. They are very much marginalized, demonized, not only by the Christian establishment, but by the Islamic establishment as well. So that's religion when it comes to gender as well. In terms of music, if you go to the conservatory, they would teach you Western classical music. And when you listen to mass media, it is Western popular music. So there is no comprehensive effort to keep alive indigenous music. There might be tokens, there might be pieces that are being taught, but music is not just the text and the melody. In our experience, in indigenous experience, it is a whole, it is a relationship with ancestral beings that you summon when you sing. And in colonial history, singing, chant, was one of the first things that the colonizers outlawed. And most of the primary oralists were the shamans, the babaylan, who have been predominantly women. So by engaging in conversation with the babaylan, you engage with issues of gender, religion, music, and so many other things. Yes, it is a creative form of resistance. If you talk to them, they may not even look at it in that way, as resistance. But just by singing your ancestral voice, despite forces against it, against that act, of course it is resistance in some way.
Perfect. I'm wondering, so we see the dethroning of female power in post-colonial spaces over and over again, and this is another aspect of that. How would you say has been your experience with these ancestral chants overcoming or bridging the gap with the male power that's existent?
Can you elucidate some more?
For example, women, have you been able to speak to anyone? Are there any kind of confidential information that you could offer us from on one-on-one by those who have males in their family who might have changed through this concept
of
music, these chants, and this form of resistance taking hold?
Well, the chanters are not only women, there are male chanters as well. And it's really
finding spaces where these voices, these ancestral voices can be heard without demonization. And the title of the panel is Ethical Scholarship. In my experience, my scholarship is always part of a bigger engagement of, as I say, providing space for these voices to be expressed and communicated by both male and female. And I have seen the transformation both in women and in men when they are given the freedom. Not that, well, you can say that it was taken away from them, because let me tell you a story. This July, we gathered a number of babaylan and other elders in my parents' home. And the women babaylan was not really free to do her rituals because the male elders were not, didn't want her to do these things because they now go to church, and these chants have been prohibited. So the female babaylan kept coming to me. I want to do this, I want to do this sacrifice, I want to do this chants and all that. It was a long story, but at the end of the 1 week gathering, the males, some of them who were also chanters, but who have not given voice to these chants for a very long time, but in this space, they were challenged to recall these voices that have been buried deep inside, because there were others who were doing the same thing, male and female. So they had to kind of, share what they knew, what they knew inside, but they were not allowing to come out. So at the end of the whole process, there was a change. At least they told this one young woman who showed signs of being called to become a babaylan, to go with their blessing, to go and learn from the babaylan. Even these male who in the beginning of the gathering were so against all this, by coming to terms with their own ancestral voice that they have not given, they have not allowed to be heard for a very long time, but by accepting that part of themselves, they allowed this young woman, with their blessing, not that she could be stopped, because we have very strong women in the Philippines.
I don't doubt that.
With their blessing, that is a world of change. I don't know what they did when they returned to their communities, but something happened there, and so the young woman now is on her way to becoming a babaylan. It's a long process, but she has accepted this call.
Thank you so much. Lynne, your project raises so many ethical issues about religious responses to the AIDS crisis. Do you see your project mainly as one about history, showing us how a gay or lesbian congregation responded to AIDS, theologically and practically, or do you see it as an opportunity for ethical reflection on contemporary issues?
Thank you for that question. It's a complicated one, and as you say, the question of ethics and morality sort of pervades the question of how religious communities have responded to AIDS in the United States, around the globe, in a lot of different ways. So it's a complicated question. I think for my research project, I'm seeing it as a historical project that's very interested in questions of moral logics and the construction of moral logics in different places. So while I would say it's probably more of a historical project, the question of the sociology of morality is something that has been of great interest to me, and it's an interest that I bring to bear in this project. This is a fascinating community, the Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco, in part because they're deeply, deeply inspired by feminist ethics of the second wave, but of women, feminists, who worked here, among other places. Letty Russell, who was one of the early WSRP people actually brought the National Council of Churches to this church in order to understand AIDS. I mean, they were very much trying to make feminist ethics a living principle when facing this utter devastation, and sort of from the basic day-to-day, how do you care for people that are so sick, and especially at the beginning when you're not sure how you're making people vulnerable to the disease, if you are, that kind of thing, to larger questions of how to ethically engage with denominations and religious organizations that are seeing a congregation like this as utterly marginal, and then how to protest. I mean, this was a protest church. It held the first ACT UP meetings in San Francisco, so how to sort of politically engage. So questions of ethics sort of permeate through the whole thing. In terms of the class, as I say, I'm interested in the sociology of morality, so I'm interested in the tensions between that different kinds of religious communities see when they face HIV. And for a lot of the communities that we'll be looking at, there's some kind of tension between either religious and cultural principle and the issues that AIDS raise, like I say, in terms of care and care provision, whether that's sort of on the congregational level, or one thing we're going to be looking at that I'm very interested in is sort of competing logics between say, the state as a care provider for HIV versus, say, public health culture that has its own sort of developed morality, and the tension that those kinds of institutions face in relation to, say, religious-based and faith-based NGOs or congregations. I think that in the world of HIV, you see these sort of competing moral ideas and moral logics trying to work themselves out in different contexts, and that's something that we'll be looking at in the class.
Perfect. So you spoke of religious and cultural tension. What would you say are like key takeaways or concepts that you guys have noticed or developed to overcome the religious and cultural tension that you've faced?
Well, I can answer that historically for this congregation. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about this congregation, I don't know how much you all know about the Metropolitan Community Church, but it was founded as a gay church, and it was founded in 1968 by Troy Perry, who was a Pentecostal, who realized that a lot of gays and lesbians weren't finding a home, a congregational home, where they could be out people. But 1968, way before the AIDS crisis, and the live question for many MCC churches in this denomination was, were they a gay church or were they a Christian church? And the congregations in this denomination fall at different points in that spectrum. For MCC San Francisco, I think one of its big takeaways for itself is that they said that they were a gay church first, and that was going to inform how they engaged with Christianity, and it enabled them to be sort of creative with the tradition in a way that if I think that other congregations that were attempting a sort of more tentative or more conciliatory or more that were trying to maintain a different kind of conversation with their home denominations and with the institution, it allowed them a sort of creative flexibility that allowed them in some ways to sort of re-engage the tradition in deeper ways that are interesting. So I think that's one interesting aspect about this congregation.
Thank you. We're going to go back to Septemmy. Hello. So going back, can interreligious dialogue heal the conditions that led to violence in Indonesia?
That's a difficult question. Based on my context with political and religious, but let me give you an example how difficult and complex it is. I am an ordained minister, I'm a Christian, and I'll sing a song that will be very controversial. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. It is a site of controversy for people in Indonesia to listen to a minister to sing a Muslim call of prayer. And that's how complex it is to put interreligious dialogue as one of the solutions to violence that has been there for the long history, especially modern history of Indonesia. But I may say this, that for me to sing that song provides me with an opportunity to look beyond the reality, yet it's really pretty much embedded in the reality. And that's what the women whom I have encountered in my context have been trying to do. Why interreligious dialogue? Interreligious dialogue have been perceived as a safe, elite, and neutral space. But based on the women's experiences, it's not. It is a very risky space because then you have to be true to who you are. At the same time, you have to be willing to open yourself to the otherness of your religious neighbor. And if the otherness of your religious neighbor has been put from within the context of long history of communal violence, then the first risky thing that you have to be able to negotiate and to maneuver is how to protect yourself, but at the same time, to embrace the other. So my research is there. Why I put risky dialogue? Because for women, it's not only about the discourse of religion, but it is about who they are, being true to themselves, like myself as a Christian, but knowing that the sound of prayer for many of those who have been living through the communal violence, that very same call of prayer has become a traumatic voice. Because every time they listen to that voice, it reminds them of the call to kill their neighbor. And when I just do not know how to sing the church bell, like tung, tung, tung. But for many Muslims also, the same thing happened. So how do you negotiate with these interreligious songs that once have become a site of dialogue, but through the history of violence, it has become a site of violence as well.
Thank you. Susanna, HTS students often wonder why they have to study languages. Would you be able to address these ethical questions? Without all your years of languages study, would you have been able to do what you did?
Thanks for that question. Yes, you all should study languages while you're here. What a great opportunity. And I'm not going to bridge the larger question of how is it ethical, but because I think it's through the nitty-gritty of language study that you open your world, right? That you open your eyes to new things, that you expand your horizons, and I think it's for us each to figure out how that relates to us as ethical subjects. But just a quick example of how important understanding language is to understanding specific contexts. In my case, specific contexts of veiling. I can tell you from the get-go that I have a problem with the title for my course, which I gave the title for my course. But the word veil itself is a little bit of a problem. There is no, for example, Arabic word that means veil as it functions as an English word. There is a variety of Arabic words that connote different kinds of head coverings. And so already we have this umbrella English term, right? Already you see the kind of colonial gesture in the use of the term veil. So just a way that language can help us to expose some of the problems that we face from the get-go and just the way we talk about these subjects. And for me, studying Antiquity Greek is my language. So those of you interested in New Testament and early Christianity, I encourage you to study. Actually, I think you're pretty much required to study Greek here if you are on one of those tracks. But so the same goes for Greek, that we don't have one single Greek term that means veil. We have a variety of things, a variety of Greek terms that somehow connoted head coverings. And so I think to begin to understand on a deeper level the historical and social contexts of men and women's veiling in late antiquity, we need to understand those words and and try to approximate them closer than just lumping everything into the term veil.
Thank you. Yuhang, we're back. How does the study of material culture address ethical concerns?
It's really a great question. I think when we think of ethics in relation to gender, the first issues comes in mind is the gender equality, right? So then how this issue, how something question like this has to do with the study of material culture. But I think Susanna actually raised this issue earlier. So I think in academia, we all probably support the maximum of gender equality. But then when come to the research, I think mostly we're dominated by the textual sources. And then, of course, I think it's the same as probably European tradition. In China, the textual sources mainly was written by men. So then women's voice was naturally excluded from those materials. I think the ethical impulse behind my mode of research is try to bring women back to the history. So just give you an example, because actually you mentioned that I work on hair embroidery in your introduction. So hair embroidery, basically, in China, as they use women, especially women, use their own hairs as thread to make an image of the icon of this Bodhisattva. So we know that in Buddhist practice, there are parallel practice of, like for instance, blood writing scriptures, right? Use one's blood to transcribe the Buddhist scriptures. But that was mainly practiced by male patriarchs. So hair embroidery, almost invisible in the written of Buddhist practice. So it's, but then we still see some records. For instance, some records saying that praising some women has really fine skills of embroidery. They even split one hair into 4 strands. I know in English, you all know the splitting hairs means, right? But in Chinese practice, we actually split one hair into 4 strands. Then the question is, first, how did they do it? And then second, what is the symbolic meaning of this action itself, right? So it's interesting, in contemporary China, in Ningbo, there are actually an institute of hair embroidery. But the funny thing is, all the artists in that place are male, are men, mainly because the head of that institute, he doesn't want to deal with women's maternal leave. So then he refused to hire women embroiderers. So then they also have a funny project. You should go there. It's really interesting. They have a gallery. And then they start this project to make hair embroidery of the portraitures of presidents in the United States. From Lincoln to Obama. You really see all of them are there. Of course, the religious context of hair embroidery already lost in contemporary China. So when I asked this one artist, male scholar, I said, I saw this record of splitting hairs. How do you think they could do that? And then he said, no, it's impossible. You can't do it. This is just a record. But then we observed splitted hairs under microscope. So which means it was there. So then, of course, this challenge, this very refinement of the skill itself is part of devotional practice. Of course, also at the same time, women have to pluck out their hairs. So same as blood writing scripture, you have to suffer the pain. So I just use this, we have many different cases. But then this case actually is a very good example to show that the importance to study material culture as a way to bring women's practice back to the history. Yeah.
Thank you. That's fascinating. So we're going to take the next few minutes, and I'm going to invite our panelists to question one another. So if you can start with Susanna and pose a question.
Sure.
Thank you.
I actually have a question for Yuhang. So I'm wondering if there are ways, I'm thinking of when you were talking about the transformation of this deity from male to female in its Chinese context. I'm wondering if there are ways that contemporary studies, like theoretical studies of gender transformation, inform your project, or maybe the other way around. If are there any kind of recuperations of this, the transformability of this deity in contemporary China to think about supporting challenges to the gender binary?
Yeah, that's really a great question. I think you're right. It's definitely the contemporary scholarship on the gender studies really kind of enforce scholars to rethink this transformative quality of this kind of two genders. So to break this binary between male versus females. So that's, I think, one really drive to make us think. Even like when we say this deity transformed into a female deity, it doesn't mean that this deity is completely a woman in the sense, for instance, this deity, when women, both man and woman have difficulty to persecute a child, they would worship her, but doesn't mean that she actually can give birth. And also on the representational level, like for instance, some of her gender identity, like breast, was never represented. So it's interesting to see this kind of ambiguity there. Yeah. So that's actually, forced us to think about, to not just draw this clear distinction between, two genders. Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. So I'm going to ask one of you to do one on this side.
Try.
Great. Thank you.
Susanna. Well, just based on what you said this morning, have you come across cases wherein the veil was, more complicated? I'm thinking of how to complicate the polarity between veil as a symbol of oppression and veil as a symbol of freedom. Have you come across cases that complicated that?
Definitely. There's one video of I think it was filmed in the 80s or 90s, maybe 1990s, of teenage Muslim women in Chicago who veiled. And the interviewer was asking them, kind of, why do you do this? Is it expression of piety? Is this what your family wants you to do? Are your parents making you veil? And many of them were veiling against their parents' best wishes. And several of those women said, I'm veiling to show solidarity with Palestinians. And so, and that surprised me. I could show my own assumptions there, but that surprised me to see these teenage women announcing political solidarity through their clothing choices. And so there, I think it starts to complicate this narrative of these women are being made to do it or something like that, when you start to see the way veiling is used as sign of political resistance in this case. And so that's one of the ways. I think when I turn to the late ancient sources, it's good for me to keep in mind the variety of things that veiling can signify now. Not that it's the same, it's not the same at all, but that there's variety. That for someone, that I need to think about fashion, what was the empress wearing on her head and how did that affect what so to think on that level, and that that can still be related to asymmetries of power and to freedom and oppression, but that there's also many different things, including fashion, including textile production, including ideas about femininity, masculinity, piety, all of just this variety, this richness of signification that's important for me to keep in mind when I look back in time. Thanks, Grace.
Thank you.
Great, thank you all. That wraps up our hour for this panel. I would invite you to give a really great round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much.